welcome back. Always good to sit. Thank you again, Doug, for helping to host, and Doug added the information that we should be aware of into the group chat. Thank you for that. A few weeks ago, I was meant to talk about a theme, a topic of Karuna, or compassion, and I talked about something different. So I said afterward that I would reschedule the compassion. Right? That's a good way to reschedule the compassion for later on. So that's actually going to be the topic of the Dharma talk today: Karuna, compassion. In Zen, there's a lot of emphasis in Zen Buddhism on wisdom and realization and insight. Right? The emphasis is really aimed into gaining realization, awakening, enlightenment, focused in that area, and the wisdom aspect is very much prized. In Zen, compassion isn't talked about as explicitly or as focused as it may be in some of the other Buddhist lineages and traditions. And there's a couple of reasons for that. I looked at the word Karuna, which we translate the Sanskrit word Karuna into the word compassion. It has an interesting root. The root of the word is kara, which means to do or to make. Right? So this says something interesting right here. To do. There's an action component in the translation, in that word for compassion. And then of course in the Latin, and I have that here, in the Latin it comes from compati, which means to suffer with. That's interesting, right? So the word compassion means to suffer with. The oldest root of it means to come together and to suffer together. Wow, what an interesting word. To suffer with. So we can say that through practice of the Dharma, through sitting, we're becoming more in touch with our innate being and the qualities that we are born with and that we refine. Right? Now, in terms of compassion, perhaps the first step there is empathy. Right? We need to have empathy in order to really to feel and manifest compassion. You need to care and to feel the suffering of ourselves and the things and the people and the world around us. There has to be that connection for it to be real, for it to really to strike our hearts. In the practice of Zazen, in the practice of meditation, it's an investigation of self-nature. That's our inquiring mind. This is the time on the cushion or in the chair when we're still, and we're actually looking at the fact of how the self appears. Now, commonly the self is taken to just be me, I, the me, I experience, that it feels separate and is experiencing a world full of difference and of other. That's the kind of the base default human condition. In meditation, not just in meditation, but certainly front and center in meditation, is we can see that this sphere of self is broader and more nuanced and complex than just the sense of me, I. The sense of me, I is like a lens which we're we commonly, we're always coming back to looking through that lens over and over, and our experience goes through that lens. But in our sitting meditation, we're opening up to a broader felt environment, the experience of our immediate environment. That can be frustrating for the human mind, because the immediate environment may not be particularly interesting or compelling just to sit and listen, or to sit and look, right? There may not be very much going on. So when there's not much going on, often the brain, that thinking part of the self, will start to say, okay, there's not much going on. How about we think about a few things? Maybe a few memories. How about an old song or two? What about that conversation I had, or the one I was meaning to be having? What about that person that really upset me? What about those things that I have to do tomorrow? Right? So in that stillness and mundanity of things just being as they are, then the brain, the mind will sort of look, okay, let me fill it with something interesting then. That's that me, I conditioned self, which we all are as human beings. But our sitting practice, meditation, is an opportunity to let me, I, take a little time off, clock off for a while, punch out, and take a rest, take a little time off. No need to think and plan or worry or ponder things, but that requires an active participation in our sitting, where the senses and the present awareness, which is natural to all of us, that is animating all of us without exception, to allow that to really to look and experience what's here. It may not be particularly interesting to me, I, but it is the preferring me, I, that keeps the self-experience a little small and narrow. When the self-experience is small and narrow, that's a sense of me, I right here, then that sense of separation with the world is usually what's being felt. If we can broaden in our sitting, in our present experience, bring in everything that is around us and be in touch with it, you see that the self is actually without limit in its reach and how broad it is. It includes feelings, perception, the sense spheres, and as we look out of a window or down the street or up at the stars at night, it sees without limit, hears for great distance. So this self is actually very broad. And then when we're in contact with our friends or our loved ones or our community of people at the grocery store, all sharing this common experience of humanity, if the self is broad and open and in contact with everything that is appearing, then that self is experienced as these other appearances. They're not appearing as particularly separate, but as all parts of this one life that we're experiencing. Then there's so much more capacity for empathetic connection, because it's not happening to another person or something else, but rather it's being experienced within our own life, this great life of the self. It's all our life. So in Zen there are several koans, or a few koans, that talk explicitly about this function of compassion, and I wanted to bring one up here. So this is from my well-worn copy at this point of a Book of Equanimity, and this is case 54, and it's called Ungun's Great Compassionate One. Okay, so attention. Ungun asked Dogo, What does the great compassionate Avalokiteshvara Bodhisattva do when she uses her manifold hands and eyes? Dogo said, it's like a person reaching behind them at night to search for their pillow. Ungan said, I understand. Dogo said, what do you understand? Ungan said, all over the body are hands and eyes. Dogo said, you've really said it. You've got 80% of it. Ungan asked, well, elder brother, how about you? And Dogo replied, throughout the body are hands and eyes. So rather than all over the body and hands and eyes, Dogo says throughout the body are hands and eyes. Okay, so here we have two monks. Ungan would become the Soto lineage, in which I'm a member, fully paid up member. He is kind of the grandfather of the Dharma grandfather of the founding of the Soto school, who would be Tozan. A couple of generations back from Tozan, we have Ungan. He's in the Soto lineage, and he's I think around 9th century, give or take a few decades. He's in this classical period of Tang Dynasty China, and he's talking with his Dharma friend and close accomplice Dogo. It said that they may have been actual brothers. They're always together and practiced at the same temple. And they're asking about the Bodhisattva of compassion. In Zen and in other lineages of Buddhism, we have different deities or different examples of deities or figures that exemplify particular qualities. And so we have Manjushri, who is the Bodhisattva of wisdom. In the Founders Hall at Yokoji, Manjushri sits on the altar in the Founders Hall, and he's sitting and he's holding a sword, and it's called the delusion cutting sword, and he has these kind of glaring, pretty intense eyes looking for delusions. Got his eye out, trying to spot some delusions, and being at Yokoji, he never runs out of things to cut. A lot of delusions here, a lot of delusions everywhere, right? So he's there, he's got his delusion cutting sword, and that's wisdom. There's another Samantabhadra, another Bodhisattva, shining practice. That's as much as I know about Samantabhadra, the Bodhisattva of shining practice. Right, so I won't go too far there. There is a wonderful Bodhisattva called Mumio in the Zen tradition. Mumio is the lowest rung on the Bodhisattva ladder. A great inspiration. Mumio means no light in Japanese, no enlightenment, not at all, completely. He is so unenlightened. Mumio lives underground in the deep earth. He pops up in a couple of places in the sutras, hopelessly deluded, but still absolutely trying his best all of the time. Real great inspiration. Then we have this case, we have Avalokiteshvara Bodhisattva Kano, or Kuan Yin, of course very famous across Asia in particular, right? In China and Japan and pretty much all of the Asian countries, I would think. Goes by different names, sometimes depicted male, sometimes female, sometimes not non-binary, sometimes there, so it appears in many different ways. And it's said that Avalokiteshvara sees the cries of the world, which of course a little different than hears the cries of the world, but sees the cries of the world. But it's a seeing that isn't just limited to the eyes. It's a seeing or a direct appraisal or being in contact with. It's the same kind of thing with our sitting practice. We're seeing. Now there is the eyes. If you sit with the eyes a little open and you look down and there's not much going on, hearing, feeling, all of the senses, and including thinking that is occurring, and you can add it all up to a direct seeing or experiencing of reality. It says that Avalokiteshvara or Canon has that relationship to suffering in the world. There's an old story in the sutras where Avalokiteshvara is so overpowered by how much suffering there is in the world that her head explodes. Just can't take it. It's just too much. And her head, one of the gods, I think it's Indra, sticks her head back together again, but makes it larger and puts a different face on every piece, so that Avalokiteshvara is able to see in all directions at once, in order to be a better servant to people, to be able to see further. And then Indra also gives her 1,000 arms. So we have these 1,000 arms, and in every hand, in every palm of a hand, there's an eye. Right? It reminds me of that movie Pan's Labyrinth. I don't know if you remember Pan. Did you ever watch that movie Pan's Labyrinth? The little girl gets chased by. Anyway, it's probably not a good comparison for Avalokiteshvara, but it's a good movie. Very violent though, so if you know. But anyway, there's that. But Avalokiteshvara, 1,000 hands, 1,000 eyes, multiple faces, and experiences the sufferings of the world. But the hands are there to help. That's our karo, to do component here, right? It's not enough to witness the suffering of the world, but there are, in this case, the eyes see it, but the hands do something about it. This is our action component of compassion, beginning with empathy and the felt connection, and now then moving into the appropriate action in order to help alleviate suffering. Buddhism, as I like to say over and over, at its core is a vehicle to reduce suffering inherent in the human experience. Buddhism is a very elegant, you could say religion, you could say spiritual path, system of thought, philosophy, practice, whatever way that you come at it. It is a beautiful system of not setting up, you know, I'm talking about these mystical deities, but they aren't really taken as being literally flying around in the clouds up there, but rather how are those qualities of compassion, wisdom, how do these function in this life, in this heart, in this body? This is how we're meant to experience these qualities. Bodhisattva of compassion, reducing suffering. Certainly we can all attest to the fact that as human beings, I can bring up a koan from 1,000 years ago. Like these koans, a lot of these were written in a reasonably quiet period in China before it devolved into the 5 dynasties and 10 warring states period. Right? So in the Zen tradition, which I know something about or read about, there would be quiet times and then there would be outright national strife and war. And that happens over and over through those centuries. And we see in the world today, fast forward 1,000 years, give or take, we have the same situation. Human beings do not seem to have learned their lessons over the last several thousand years or millennia. We're still doing the same terrible, violent, divisive, strife, right? I mean, that's what's going on. And so these teachings are as relevant in the Buddha's day as they are today. And the teachings of Buddhism point out, how do we create suffering? There is suffering, as the Buddha points out in the Four Noble Truths, or dukkha. But there's a lot of dukkha, a lot of suffering and delusion, which is just unnecessary, and it's caused through delusion. Our primary cause of suffering and delusion is buying into self-other separation as a literal truth. Right? So we have this curious consciousness as human beings where we're able to object everything. We have a dualistic consciousness navigating the world. It's a wonderful quality and a wonderful tool. We've been able to accomplish a lot over these thousands of years, but it has a real dark side to it, with its ability to other, with the ability to cut off, separate, and have no empathy or connection with others. That is also there. Now, in the koan, Ungen asks Dogo, you know, so this great compassionate bodhisattva has all of these hands and eyes. What does a great compassionate bodhisattva do when she uses these hands and eyes? That's what Ungen asks. And Dogo says something very curious. Instead of Dogo saying, well, what Avalokiteshvara does, she sees that all of this suffering going on, and then she does something about it. That's just what I said, right? Not a very elegant answer. Quite, you know, a ballpark explanation. Dogo says something much more pointed. It's like a person reaching behind them at night searching for their pillow. This is Dogo's great example of compassionate action and compassionate response. Like a person in the middle of the night. Like we can picture that for ourselves when we fall asleep at night, and maybe you know, we go through your little deep sleep and then your little waking cycle. Maybe, you know, you're tossing and turning a little bit and your head slips off the pillow. And then unconsciously, you perhaps grab the pillow and pull it back under your head and fall back asleep. And in the morning, the alarm clock goes off and there's not even any recollection of that compassionate activity that occurred. And what kind of compassionate activity is that? A person is lying in bed with no support for the head, uncomfortable. A person reaches for a pillow and slides it helpfully under that person's head. But we can see in this example that it's not about what I am doing for somebody else, or what somebody else is doing for me, or really what I'm doing for myself. It's just a very straightforward and elegant action response. Action response, problem response to problem, in a very appropriate simple context for appropriate response. Now this is happening in our lives all of the time. If we look in the world, there's so much complexity in the world, and there's so much difficulty, and it's so huge. There's so many people and the problems are so vast. And as human beings, we can feel daunted, helpless, or paralyzed facing the tasks that the world needs to take care of. But in our daily activity, in our everyday activity, there is always this appropriate response to suffering and difficulty that's taking place in ways small and large. The question is what is the appropriate response to the suffering that we're identifying? And what can be done to alleviate that suffering? And that is a living koan for all of us. One of the reasons compassion isn't focused, I think, so much on in the Zen school is there's a feeling that if you sit, if you practice, and if you really live present awareness, and that is something that we can be doing on and off our meditation cushion or bench or chair, we can be living an awake, present life. Right? We all have that opportunity every day to live an awake, present life. If we are doing that, if that's how we live, if that's what you are, that's what you transmit, that's what you express, then naturally, the compassionate response, it becomes available. The appropriate response becomes available. If each one of us has to always think about what the response ought to be, then quite easily we can get mired in our ideas and conditioned ideas about what the response should be. Or we can get mired and confused by a narrative that the world is spinning us about what the appropriate response should be. Right? That's a very powerful thing in society and in the world. Join our club. We're on the side of right. Right? But it's always an individual response and an individual choice to really make the decision about what is appropriate. If that decision is made from a place of present, engaged awareness, it doesn't have to be cooked up in the mind so much, thought through, pondered, and worked out so much, but rather, really, if we really push this to its ends here, if you were awake, alive, present, and dare I say enlightened, then the world will use you for good purpose. It will function through you for good purpose. At the root, there's no problem. In present awareness, there's no difficulty. There's no suffering. But in the human realm, there is always difficulty and suffering, caused by, ultimately, our dualistic understanding of reality. Dogo gives an answer here where there's no dualism at all. The guy's not even awake, or the person's not even awake. They just reach for a pillow. There's no discrimination. There's no weighing or picking. There's just functioning. Okay, so Ungen then says, oh, I understand. I understand. And Dogo presses and says, what do you understand? Ungen said, all over the body, our hands and eyes. He says he understands that point, that to live this life, yes, all over this body, your body, my body, everyone's body, this whole, we have hands and eyes, we have the ability to be able to be of service. We have the opportunity, our eyes are open and we've got hands. We can do something. We can be of use. We can help. He says he understands that. Dogo says, yep, you got 80% of it there. This is a motif that comes up in Zen. There's 80%. It's said that it's better to say 80% of it with a few words. So he says, yeah, you got 80%. Spoiler alert, nobody's got 100%. right? Nobody understands 100%. 80% is pretty good. It's a solid B. But Ungan asks, elder brother, how about you? Which is a nice way of just saying, okay, smart ass, what do you say? You know, because he kind of baits him into that. And Dogo says, throughout the body are hands and eyes. And this is taken as being perhaps a tricky point in this koan. What's the difference between all over the body are hands and eyes and throughout the body is hands and eyes? I'll leave that to you. I'm going to open it up for questions, for comment up to this point. If you like to comment on what the difference between throughout the body rather than all over the body, if that strikes you, please feel free to comment, or anything at all here. It's you take the word compassion. It's very hard to talk on this point in one Dharma talk for one short meeting. But with the time we have, I'd like to open it up. Please raise a hand, wave your hand over your head, flick the light switch on and off, whatever you need to do to draw attention, and I'd love to hear from you. I'm going to turn my fan down a bit while you do that. Let's just sit for a moment, and then I'll ring the bell in just a minute. But perhaps we could just close with just a minute or so, just to let go again with these talks and these things. You know, if they provoke and they disrupt and they like touch us in ways, let them get under the skin, and then they, you know, these conversations, they work on us from the inside out. You don't have to worry about it between the ears. It'll take care of itself. Let's just sit for a moment and then we'll close. Thank you, my friends. Thank you for practicing this afternoon, for coming along, supporting ICD, all you do in your lives. To see you in person very soon. Take good care.